before we get into any content, we want to make sure we're starting in a good way. So it is my great pleasure to invite Bikani Elder Harley Proshu to do an opening prayer and some opening remarks. Over to you, Harley.
Okay, I guess I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you very much. Sometimes the technology doesn't work as smoothly as we hope it will, but it's an honor to be here, and thank you, Kisha. Today, it's special. To be able to, come together like this and learn about ground searches and hear about all the different types of searches that can be used. But before that, as Kisha said, my name's Harley Croshoe. I'm Blackfoot from Piikani Nation, and my name is Gayupika, which is Bear Child. I'm on the National Advisory Committee also, and and today, I have the honor of starting off with a prayer and to start the conversations in a good way. And I think the opportunity to share the expertise and the knowledge from the presenters. We just want to thank you for that, for all of them, and certainly we look forward to learning, and we look forward to seeing how these different types of searches can help us. So important because our children, the ones that were taken away, ones that never came home, be able to find them and be able to find where they are and be able to you know have ceremony and find ways of bringing them back and having the ceremony that ensures that it's done in a good way, in a spiritual way. And it's so important. This journey that we're all on, it's quite difficult, and it quite can be quite hard because it's a heavy journey, and it's as a result of the impact of the residential school, and it's as a result of the past, of the historical past of our parents, our grandparents, even our sisters, brothers, having to be taken away and experiencing what they experienced in the residential school, and once we understand that and learn that and realize and understand why we're here where we are today, and what we need to do to work together to change that future and to help on that journey, to support each other and help each other as we move forward. That's why we're here today. And so before I start the prayer, I like to take a moment of reflection just to acknowledge and recognize the children that were taken away, and the ones that never came home, and the ones that are as will always be in our hearts, and we'll always miss them. But let's just take that time to do that reflection before I start prayer, and with the tobacco and with the eagle feather, that eagle spirit will carry our prayers to the Creator, and and we know that the Creator is with us, watches over us, and we know that as we continue on this journey, it can be very challenging, and so let's pray for the people that just don't quite understand the impact of this, and the people that can be part of those barriers, and pray for them too, because they pray for understanding and pray that their hearts and minds open, but also for all of us that are dealing with family members that are working on this and trying to find ways of bringing our children home. So with that, I'll start the prayer. we'll start off with a pause for those young spirits that never came home. Greater Grandfather, you know him by many loving names. I come before you in a humble way. With tears in my eyes, ancient song in my heart, I pray to the powers of creation, to Grandfather Sun, Grandmother Moon, to Mother Earth, and to my ancestors, the holy grandmothers and grandfathers. I pray for my relatives in nature, the ones that fly, swim, crawl, and walk, the ones that are seen and unseen. And Creator, thank you for this opportunity to come to you in prayer. Creator, you've given us so many gifts in our lives and teachings that help us and give us strength. And the greatest gift of all is the gift of life. Be able to experience those many wonders that you have given us and brought to us, Creator. We give thanks for that. We give thanks for our families because they're so important to us, Creator. You know, without our families, we wouldn't be able to do what we do each and every day. And our families are the people that we work with also, and the people that we engage with each and every day. So we give thanks for them and ask you to watch over them and protect them all. We give thanks to our elders, our grandparents that teach us and guide us with that sacred wisdom. And we give thanks for them, pray for them too, to watch over them, protect them, and give them the health and the strength they need to continue that work that they do. Creator, I give thanks for being able to come together here, you know, and have this opportunity to gather and to really hear and learn of these these techniques and technologies that will help us in that journey that we're on and finding our children that never came back home from the residential school, and be able to you know, help support each other as we move forward on this journey. Creator, it's such an opportunity to really come together and be one as we take this journey forward, and as we take each step. We ask for, you know, clarity. We ask for strength and wisdom, so we know that we're moving forward in the right way, in a good way. Creator, be with us today and watch over us, all of us, no matter where we're calling in from. Because Creator, this is an opportunity we have to really gain more knowledge, and with that knowledge, we'll be able to use that as we continue forward. Ask for beauty above us, ask for beauty below us, ask for beauty around us. Creator, ask for beauty in each and every one of us. And again, Creator, thank you for this opportunity to come to you in prayer. All my relations, thank you. Back to you, Kisha.
Hi, Kinnesquint and Elder Koshu for the opening prayer and the reflection and reminder of the difficult work that is being undertaken right now. So the purpose of we're gathered here today for the webinar, Beyond Ground Penetrating Radar, How Other Techniques Can Complement GPR and Help in the Search for Residential Schools Unmarked Burials, which is sponsored, of course, by the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Just a couple of quick reminders as we move through. This will be discussing the search for unmarked graves. And while there will not be any images shown of particular contexts that relate to residential school unmarked graves, there may be other graves shown from different kinds of places to demonstrate the materials that are being shared. The residential school crisis line is always available for survivors if you are finding this a difficult conversation, but also a reminder that after or during this presentation, there may be times in which it may be difficult to hear or you may get triggered, so take care of yourself and do what is needed. Also, just as a reminder, the National Advisory Committee has a series of resources, including other webinars, and as well as documents that are designed to assist communities who are undertaking this sacred work. And you can find all that information on our website at nac-cnn.ca at any time. This webinar is also being recorded and will be posted on the NAC website upon its completion. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information around other types of search technologies. Many nations who have undertaken this work over the past several decades have focused on using ground-penetrating radar to search for unmarked burials, but it is not the only technique that is available. And often, once results come in from ground-penetrating radar, additional information is required to provide more confidence that what is being found is an unmarked grave. So what this webinar is designed to do is look at other options for ground searches that can bring additional information to ground penetrating radar, or that may be undertaken when ground penetrating radar is not ideal in the environment that is being searched. So this idea that other things can complement or layer. We also will have an opportunity to address questions from communities and survivors and search teams about different technical options. What are the pros and cons, limitations and challenges? So please do take your questions and we will be able to answer them or try to answer them at the end of the presentations. A quick note, the act of searching the ground to find unmarked graves is not to prove that children died. We know they did. There's extensive archival records. There is survivor testimony and community knowledge of thousands of children who never returned from Indian residential schools, as well as related institutions. What ground searches are doing is providing the specific locations that might require further investigation and additional lines of evidence to support what we already know and empower communities to be able to take those next steps, whatever they may choose. So we'll be focusing today on kind of an in-between ground penetrating radar and any forensic investigation. The methods that we're discussing here are generally non or minimally invasive, and we look forward to being able to share some of this information with you today. We have 4 presenters. I will introduce them each briefly as they come in to present, but in the order that they are coming in, we'll start with Dr. Andrew Martindale, move on to Ed Eastaugh, then Dr. Terrence Clark, and Dr. Sarah Beaulieu. And so as they're transitioning into sharing their slides, I will provide a brief introduction and invite them to share their knowledge. So our first presenter is Dr. Andrew Martindale, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia. He's also a National Advisory Committee member and a founding member of the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group on Unmarked Graves. He has been working with Indigenous communities to search for unmarked graves for the last 2 decades, and is here to talk a little bit about the role of LiDAR and other underwater considerations for searching. So I will hand it over to Dr. Martindale.
Thank you, Kisha. Hello, everybody. An honor to be among you today to talk about this difficult issue. I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can make best use of our time. As Kisha mentioned, I want to talk about 2 areas where we might deploy new technologies or emerging technologies to help us in the investigation for looking for missing children. One is LiDAR, which you've likely heard about. And then the other is the more complicated space of underwater landscapes and underwater locations, which there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on them. And typically, what we're facing in the endeavor of locating missing children is identifying potential technologies that might have value and bringing them to bear on this particular issue. In many cases, they've never been used in this purpose before. And so there's a degree of refinement and evaluation that is needed. And we're all engaged in that. Many of us are. So this is the beginning of a longer pathway. We know the work ahead will take a long time, decades likely. And the refinements to our methods will be something that we will be endeavoring to complete will be an ongoing process. And our purpose of the National Advisory Committee is to provide you with the best guidance that we have right now. But many of these technologies are developing quickly, LiDAR among them. And let me begin with this. Here we are. LiDAR is, perhaps you've heard of this. Likely, if you are engaged in a search, you have already encountered it. You may even have done some collection of this information. It is an acronym like radar. It stands for light detection and ranging. And it is a technology that allows us to map surfaces in 3 dimensions using light. It's quite an innovation. In fact, it has taken over and appears in many parts of our lives. I'll mention that in a second. But the need for this kind of technology is pretty ubiquitous. Most of us doing this work will rely or turn to LiDAR at some point. Something that will supplement other technologies that we work with, sometimes that will support other ways of understanding the landscape, and sometimes LiDAR itself is direct evidence of the kind of information we are looking for. So the tasks that we face is that we need to collect data in field contexts. We need to evaluate and compile archival information. We need to locate information coming to us from survivor testimony. And we need to place in some map-like space the results of our search inquiries. And LiDAR provides a base map, a solution for this kind of work. It gives us a relatively accessible way to collect a 3-dimensional model of land surfaces against which we can do all of these things. We can deploy our field data and place it in this map. We can present archival data correctly on the modern landscape using this as a baseline piece of information. We can locate information coming from survivors, and then we can place our search results, our search endeavors in this context. So LiDAR is a ubiquitous and useful tool for a number of reasons. We are going to use it typically in the context of what is known as a GIS, or a geographical information system, a digital form of spatial archiving, of map making and managing spatial data. We can use GISs in a number of ways. We have access to archival information. Many governments, many jurisdictions have data that we can draw on to populate our digital maps, if you will. Many communities, not all, but some communities have their own GIS departments to manage their jurisdiction, their planning and land use management. So GIS is something that, again, has a role in a lot of places in our lives. We will see it primarily in ground searches as a place to hold data, to evaluate and compare data, and to identify the location of information that we're acquiring through different ways: survivor testimony, ground searches. And LiDAR is one of the key tools because it gives us a really useful, really detailed base map against which we can array this other information. So Kisha and I were talking earlier about the need for perhaps a webinar on data management, data sovereignty, and GIS. This is another piece of the work ahead. If it's something that's novel to you or new to you, we will provide. We have some guidance and support. It's likely going to be a very useful tool, no matter how you're approaching ground searches. LiDAR is a revolutionary technology, and it is literally all around us now. It is ubiquitous. It's transformed a lot of ways that we live in the world. It is the basis of self-driving autonomous vehicles, including cars. They send out LiDAR signals to manage where they are. It's now available on many of our smart devices. You can get a 3-dimensional modeling application on your phone, and it's using LiDAR. And many jurisdictions are using LiDAR to map what they already have on the land, their infrastructure, urban landscapes, natural landscapes, geological landscapes. It is really changing how we understand the environment around us because it provides us with a fast, efficient, and very accurate rendering of the Earth's surface, something that's actually quite hard to do otherwise. How it works is really just a process of sending out a light signal and returning a reflection, and then mapping what that reflection is. The kind of signal that's being sent out is a light wave. It's not a visible light wave, but it's light. The key really to LiDAR is the quantity of the signal. It sends out, in some cases, in some devices, 2 million signals a second. So it sends out an enormous amount of information and returns then a substantial reflection, which with advanced computing, it can process and turn into a 3-dimensional model of what's on the land. So that's a kind of a complicated story, but as people involved in searches, we are consumers, we're users of this technology. How it works, is important to know a little bit about, but that it works is really the key message. Most of the LiDAR that we will be encountering in ground searches, we will collect or will be collected for us in one of three ways, either by an aircraft that tends to cover wide regions, but not very high resolution. More commonly, we'll see a drone, a UAV, and that will allow us to have higher resolution, but only over a smaller area. And I think most communities that are conducting ground searches that have used LiDAR will be using it with drones. There's another option, which I'll talk about in a second, which is a handheld tool. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So typically when we're engaging in the landscapes of residential schools, we're looking at an area of a few hundred acres. And that is where a drone-based tool will work well. We can cover that kind of landscape in a day and collect a high-resolution, three-dimensional map of the landscape. And that's a valuable contribution, as I say, to our understanding of the landform and a place against which to put other information that we get from other sources. So the drone system is one that you'll probably see more commonly. There is on the right, you can see here a handheld device. There are a number of these now in the market. And again, they're increasing in capacity. I will mention that over the last 2 or 3 years, the resolution of this technology has grown considerably. It's now 10 times more accurate than it was 2 or 3 years ago. So we are in the midst of this technological revolution that assists us, but keeping pace with it can be a bit daunting. The handheld tool allows us to see underneath things. It's typically used by engineers to work inside buildings, and we can deploy it underneath forest covers in areas where the drone cannot see as easily. So it's a complement to the overhead tool that the drone creates. Similar cameras, these two devices are very similar. They're held in different ways. Just a little image of what a LiDAR result might look like. This is a cross section of a landform that's covered in trees. And in this purpose, this wasn't for residential school inquiries. We were really just interested in the land and the ground underneath the trees. What LiDAR allows you to do then is to see the ground surface when it's open or even when it's obscured by vegetation, because with all the signal that's being sent out, some of those light beams will hit the ground. They'll get through the leaves and they'll bounce off the ground and return to the detector. And that allows us to map the land surface even underneath forest canopy. Again, we can improve that if we walk under the forest with a handheld tool. And I just want to pause. If some of you are actually collecting LiDAR, there are, and you're in the process now of managing LiDAR files, you have a number of options. So some of you, this is a new technology that you will be exploring in the future. Some of you may be already relying on it. And if you are relying on it, there are different ways to take what is called the point cloud, the very large array of whatever it is the LiDAR detector is encountering, and reduce it down to what you're interested in, which is, for us, typically the ground surface. Some of the GIS programs will do this. ArcGIS has some features. You can buy off-the-shelf software that will do it. And various scholars around the world have developed freeware to allow you to refine that cloud and resolve what it is you might be interested in. And what are you interested in? Well, my last slide coming up in a second is going to show you some results from a cemetery. We're interested both in a landscape of these institutions against which we can put other information, but in some cases, the LiDAR itself will reveal to us the location of graves if the surface shape of the land changes because the grave is there. So here is the next picture. This is LiDAR on the left from a cemetery, and you can see that in the shape of the land, there are graves. They're visible both as monuments, but also as depressions and as slight raised areas. You will encounter this if you walk through a cemetery. Some places of burial have a depression, some have a slight mound, and these are indicative of the burial itself. LiDAR allows us to identify that as one pathway. In the middle, the picture is of a photo map created by the drone that flew the LiDAR, a high resolution Google Earth, if you will, image, a picture map created at high resolution. And on the right, the lower right, you'll see an image of that where we have arrayed the ground penetrating radar lines that have been collecting the GPR data. So this illustrates the value of LiDAR creating for us a space against which we can put other information. If we find something in the radar, we want to know not only know what it is, but where it is. And LiDAR allows us to take that step more easily with greater accuracy and greater precision. So my expectation is that LiDAR will be useful in almost all, probably all of the residential school landscapes that people are working on. If you're using it, then you'll be wanting to refine it. If you haven't thought of it yet, if you haven't encountered it yet, it could well be a useful tool for you. And we can talk more about what that might look like in the days and weeks ahead. I'm going to pivot now and talk about underwater contexts just briefly, because unlike land contexts, there has not been much work in underwater. We know that underwater landscapes are relevant to the search for missing children. We've heard from survivors that children are located in bodies of water. We have not yet heard of anybody embarking upon searches in underwater contexts, but the story of children being underwater is something that we've heard regularly, both on coastal marine landscapes and in inland lakes and other kinds of water bodies. We know also that underwater ancestral remains of the children will be much less likely to preserve, but that's not going to stop us from looking and doing our very best. There are methods that exist for exploring things underwater, and they're going to need some development as people begin to deploy them in this effort. We can obviously go underwater in person using dive teams. We can take remote tools, much like we do with landforms and drones. And there's analogs to ground penetrating radar for underwater applications. So let's take a brief look at these, just to give you a sense that if you are facing underwater location, there are potential pathways ahead. They will need refinement, but some of us are working on this endeavor and hope to provide some results for you in the coming months. The challenges are similar to being on land. We want to map the underwater landscape, the floor of the ocean or the lake, partly because this is a base map for other work. Possibly there are associated features that are correlating with the children. And there may be, but it is highly unlikely that we will find actual ancestral remains, as challenging as that thought is. Again, we haven't done it yet, so we don't quite know what we will find and what we won't find, but it's less likely underwater. We can also explore the surface below the floor of the ocean or the lake, much again like ground penetrating radar. And it's possible, but an intentional burial beneath sediments in these water bodies seems also unlikely, but sometimes information and materials may sink. And so there is value in looking beneath the floor of the ocean or the lake. And the technologies are available. They're typically used for other purposes. We have, much as we can build a photo map from a drone, you can build an underwater photo map using a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV. In this case, we have a shipwreck, and the model is building from a set of photos a three-dimensional map of that shipwreck. These tend to be relatively inexpensive. We're talking a few $1,000s for entry-level devices, and not that difficult to operate. The software is relatively accessible, but they typically benefit from clear water. A lot of turbidity, a lot of obscuring makes it more difficult to work with this technology. This technology is quite ubiquitous. This is sonar, essentially fish finders, and it's become very advanced in the last decade. We now can, for most boats are deployed at relatively inexpensive cost with sonar. And side scanning sonar is typically an option for these units that are attached to boats, either as navigational tools or for fish finding. You can map the landform underneath the boat or the floor of the ocean or the lake, and it provides resolution of reasonably high quality, not super precise, but it is there. In the upper right image, you can see the image of a bicycle. You can see also plants and various landforms. So this is a tool that we can use. It's commonly used, and I think it will be a useful beginning tool, but probably not the last tool we'll want to deploy. LiDAR does work underwater, and you can fly LiDAR drones over water bodies, and in some cases get signals, again, if the water is relatively clear, to depths of several hundred meters. So it's not impossible to get a LiDAR-like map underneath the water column. You can also put LiDAR devices in the water itself, again, on ROVs, on remotely operated vehicles, these robotic little machines that will go under the water to collect maps of the ground surface. Again, these are technologies that exist for other purposes, for, in this case, mapping pipelines, mapping harbors, identifying infrastructure that's under the water. So they're already being used, but they're not being used for the purpose that we want to apply them for. And so there's an adjustment that we're going to be engaging in to learn how to best use them, to learn what works well and what works well in different contexts, and to develop guidance. So this is a very much an emerging endeavor. As far as I can tell, nobody has yet tried to work beyond side scanning sonar. You can do what's called a multi-beam approach, which is a much more advanced piece of equipment that creates a much higher resolution map. And this is something that's deployed typically when mapping harbors by harbor authorities who need to know what's on the ground or on the floor surface for navigation. And these are things that are either put onto a remotely operated boat or towed behind a small boat in order to collect the data. And they are kind of a higher resolution version of side scanning sonar. If fish finders are something that most boats have, very few will have this tool. It's about 10 or 20 times as expensive, but it produces a much higher resolution image. And that will produce as an image of the floor of the ocean or the lake. Is there information on that about the ancestors? It's hard to say. But it will be a beginning step for any investigation that we might want to take underwater. The last piece I'll mention then is this notion that you can actually look beneath the sediments of bodies of water. And it's an analogous to or similar to ground penetrating radar, but underwater. It uses similar frequencies. And it's called sub-bottom profiling. It can be done off of a vessel itself, or it can be towed on a tethered device behind a boat. And it floats just above the ground, or the base of the lake or the ocean, and sends out signals into the sediment, which it then returns, and that reflection allows it to map qualities of the geology of the landform beneath the water into the sediments. It's being again deployed typically for industry. It's not being used, as far as I can tell, for this kind of work, but it has some potential for the investigative work ahead. So where LiDAR is well presented to us, we know it's working. We have demonstrated value in residential school landscapes, and we can use it pretty much directly. Underwater contexts are very much in the beginning phase. And although I say that, I can tell you that some communities are beginning this work. Penelakut is one where we are beginning work with side scanning sonar, and we hope in the new year to get sufficient funding to deploy and test some of these other technologies. If you know this landscape, this is the landscape of the Cooper Island Industrial School. It was faced, of course, right onto a body of water. And there are stories, unfortunately, of children in that water. So this is a landscape where this work is being deployed. There are many across the country, something that we will be able to update you on, hopefully in the coming months ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for presenting information about different ways to map and understand underwater and terrestrial landscapes. I'd now like to invite Ed Eastaugh, who is a lab supervisor at the University of Western Ontario's Department of Anthropology, is an expert in geophysical techniques and has been supporting nations using different types of near-surface geophysics. So I will invite Ed to present now.
Thank you very much, Kisha. I'm very honored to be here today to talk a little bit about magnetic survey methods that you might want to employ in your searches. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay, can someone confirm that you can see my screen and you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so magnetic survey methods. I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk to you about two methods, magnetometry and magnetic susceptibility. Magnetometry is actually one of the more common geophysics techniques that we use in archaeology. It is demonstrated and proven to be able to locate graves. But you probably haven't heard about it because in most situations, ground penetrating radar tends to be the most suitable. But as we've heard, there are situations where that's not possible. And that's one of the reasons we're here to talk to you about these other techniques. And then the other technique is magnetic susceptibility, which isn't broadly used as much in archaeology and particularly not in grave detection. Having said that, we have been doing some experimental work here with our community partners, and we're getting some quite interesting results. So I just wanted to be able to share some of those results with you today. So what are the magnetic survey methods that we use? So like any other geophysical survey technique, like ground penetrating radar, we use these to identify and map objects and features that are buried beneath the ground. In magnetometry, we're measuring tiny differences in the Earth's magnetic field that are caused by buried objects and features. And then in magnetic susceptibility, we're measuring the ability of a material to become magnetized in the presence of a magnetic field. And like most of the approaches in archaeology, these techniques do not harm features below the ground in any way. So I want to start off by saying we're dealing with magnetometry, and both these, or rather with magnetic methods, and both these techniques do and can identify metal, but metal isn't actually our primary target in these investigations. And that's, if I actually just go back, that's partly because both of these techniques don't actually generally investigate the ground that deeply. Magnetometry, we're really only concerned with about the top meter of the ground. And with magnetic susceptibility, we're only really investigating really the very surface, sort of 10 or 15 centimeters of the ground. And the other reason that we're not necessarily looking for the metal associated with burials, such as the coffin nails and handles, although that can in some situations be helpful, is that grounds around residential schools have often been used for decades, and there's going to be a lot of metal just from other sources in the ground. And then so distinguishing the metal associated with the grave from that around it is also going to be quite difficult. So if we're not looking for metal, what are we actually investigating? So the key really is the topsoil. So when soils are formed, magnetic materials tend to concentrate in the topsoil. So here we've got a profile through the ground, and you can see that dark earth, sort of organic rich soil on the top. So that layer is generally more magnetic, or has more magnetic properties than the underlying subsoil. And that's useful because when humans occupy a landscape, we often dig holes and we build things and we move that soil around. And what happens is some areas where we pile up topsoil become more magnetically enhanced, and areas where we've removed that become sort of not so magnetic. And here I've actually just got a little diagram showing you sort of the potential disturbance of topsoil when we put a grave in. So you can see here that we've got a layer of more magnetic topsoil, that when you dig the grave to bury the coffin, all that soil is removed, going through the topsoil and into the subsoil. And then when that soil's placed back in the grave, it's often mixed up. And so the area immediately above the grave isn't quite so magnetic, doesn't have such strong magnetism. That isn't always the case. The important part here is it just needs to be different. So it could be more magnetically enhanced. Sometimes graves subside. We've seen in Andrew's LiDAR, we often get depressions in graves, and it's not unusual for, particularly on maintained cemeteries, for graves to have additional topsoil added on top of the grave, which actually ends up with increased topsoil. And what that does is that the grave itself has different magnetic properties, and that affects the magnetic field directly above it, which we measure with a magnetometer, or more directly with a magnetic susceptibility meter. For those of you who have started your searches with ground penetrating radar, this will look very familiar to you. The way we do our magnetic survey is in gridded survey usually. We set up grids over our area we wish to investigate, and we walk backwards and forwards, collecting data along survey lines. And depending on how many points we collect and how close those lines are spaced together will determine how accurately and the resolution of the results that we get. And here I just have a couple of examples. So this is actually some 19th century settler burials up in Mersey Bay, some sailors who died up in Mersey Bay up in the Arctic. So the three black blobs labeled A are actually burials. And if you look at them, you can see that if you compare them to the scale, they're about 2 meters long and about a little under 1 meter wide. And then again, if you look at the relation to the north arrow, we can see they're aligned east-west. And we had historic documents indicating that there were 3 sailors buried on this site, and we just didn't know quite where they were. So we were able to put this all together and establish where those burials were. And this is an example of magnetic susceptibility data. And like I say, this is more in the experimental phase. So what we have here is a test area where we have done some survey on a cemetery, an historic settler cemetery here in London, Ontario. And we are seeing, in this case, we're actually seeing increased susceptibility in front of the headstones. What we're not quite getting yet is being able to get the definition to make these discrete individual features, such as the individual graves. And part of the reason for that is this technique is very slow, or at least it is with the instrument we're using at the moment. So we are going to be in the process of trying to refine our techniques to get better resolution and speed up this process. But I'm actually quite encouraged with the results we've been getting so far. So when might you actually want to use these methods? Well, one of the first reasons we often use magnetic methods are they are usually quite a bit faster than the other techniques that we can employ, such as ground penetrating radar. And as we know, many of the school sites are quite large. And so if we want to try and narrow down our search areas to try and sort of concentrate our efforts, then these techniques might help us identify which those areas are. We might also be interested in identifying other features that no longer survive above the ground surface, such as old building foundations or modern services such as pipes and pipelines, which are going to influence the ground penetrating radar results. So this is a quick way of really getting a good handle of what's going on under the ground. Of course, there's also the instances where ground penetrating radar might not work, depending on what the geology or the ground cover or the site history is like. So this might be another instance where you might wish to employ magnetometry if you can determine that magnetometry is going to be appropriate in that circumstance. But to my mind, the most powerful use of this is when it's used in combination with other approaches. And this allows us to increase confidence in our results. So when we're seeing features or targets of interest in multiple methods, all at once, indicating the location of a burial in a single location. That helps us sort of determine the likelihood that there's actually something there. And that's pretty much really, it's also a very quick, broad overview of what I wanted to talk about. There's quite magnetic survey methods are a little bit involved. You need to get a good understanding of the site history and whether the geology is suitable or not. But it's certainly something that you should certainly consider. Anyway, thank you for your time. And I know there's lots of resources on the NAC website and also the Canadian Archaeological Association's resources for communities conducting residential searches. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing that information with us. So you've seen two presentations that deal with characteristics of the Earth, either the surface or the subsurface, and how we might measure those to help understand locations of unmarked burials. We are now going to transition to two presentations which are more directly about detecting potentially the presence of human remains with minimally or non-invasive methods. So that will be what we're going to transition to. And I'm first now going to invite Dr. Terrence Clark, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Saskatchewan, and who has been working to support many nations in Saskatchewan and BC over the past several years to help locate missing children. So over to you.
Thank you, Kisha. I'll just try to share my screen and hopefully everything works well. All right, I assume that you can see this. So today I'm going to be talking about a very new technology. It's using soil spectroscopy, which is essentially trying to determine the chemical composition of the soil, looking specifically for human remains. And here we go. Come on. Here, okay. So as we've heard and as we've discussed previously, ground penetrating radar is the most preferred method for determining where burials are likely to be, but it does have some issues. And so one of those issues is that it works really well where the burials are discrete and undisturbed. But even where these contexts are undisturbed, it might have problems. And I just alluded to some of these. It could be geology or other issues. But ground penetrating radar can't say 100% that a burial is present. It can say that one is likely or probably present. And obviously we're getting closer and closer to achieving higher confidence levels here, but still it's not 100%. So when we use GPR, we have to bear in mind that some of the anomalies that are located may not be burials. They may be something else that are very close to burials. And we know that we're absolutely going to miss some burials where the context is disturbed. So one way to get around this, and Ed has talked about this, and so did Andrew, the idea of just layering multiple technologies. I think this is very wise. And as you do this, the magnetometry, the GPR, they can all line up and give you better results. Soil spectroscopy and herd dogs are another important step in the process to confirm these. And one benefit of soil spectroscopy is even if the burials are disturbed and the shape of the burial pit is no longer visible, it's invisible to GPR. And in fact, the magnetometry will have big issues with this too if everything has been dug up to put in a water line or something like that. The burial still is there. The human remains are still there. And so soil spectroscopy can still locate that child. So what is it? Essentially, we're using light to characterize the composition of the soil. So unlike the two techniques you've heard about so far, this is minimally invasive, meaning the probe is pushed into the ground. It doesn't remove any soil. It doesn't take a sample. It doesn't disturb any of the remains, but it does go into the soil and shine a light onto the soil that's present. And so the probe is about the size of your pinky finger. It can be inserted into the soil up to a depth of almost a meter. As it's going through the soil, it's shining light onto the sediment that it's encountering. The reflection is captured by the sensor, and the chemical composition is analyzed in real time as it's going through the ground. And so why this is really important is that in burial context, we can get the residue of human burial for a very, very long time. So when we die and our bodies return to the earth, some residue turns into fatty salts. These salts are not water soluble. And so unlike DNA, they don't move around in the water table. It doesn't really matter how much runoff there's been in this area. You're going to get very stable locations of where those burials were. And even in contexts where the bones have completely decayed and there would be nothing for us to find if we were to excavate, the fatty salts will remain in the soil and can be detected with spectroscopy. So we have been working with our research partner, S4 Mobile Technologies, or S4 Mobile Laboratories, and this is the Subterra Gray. This is a prototype that we've been using in a number of contexts since last spring. We've tested it in mock burial situations and historic cemeteries in the US and in Canada. And we've tested it also in a number of residential school contexts in Canada. And what this equipment is doing is measuring the spectra and the insertion pressure, which I'll talk about right now. So the insertion pressure, just like Ed was saying, as you're excavating a grave and then putting the sediment back in the grave on top of the burial, that creates a difference in that area. And so over here on the top right, you can see a burial. This is from a historic cemetery in Saskatchewan. And as we're testing across this feature, we're going to find areas that are outside the burial pit that remain consistently hard. And when we get into the area that's been excavated, we're going to find out that sediment is softer and it's going to retain water differently. And it's really that difference in the composition of the sediment within the burial pit that we're finding in GPR as well. And so as we're testing in a line across these graves, we see that the pressure changes considerably once we get into the burial, and that even after hundreds of years in historic cemeteries, this doesn't change, that the areas that have been previously disturbed will be softer than areas that have never been dug. And so using this insertion pressure alongside the spectra, which is the chemical composition of the soil, can give us two lines of evidence for confirming unmarked graves. So the joy of this technology is that it gives you results immediately. We had been investigating the use of environmental DNA as another way to confirm human remains that are present in the soil. However, that is not as quick. Often you need to send samples back to the lab. Here immediately, the probe goes in, it takes 90 seconds, it comes back out of the soil and shows you here on the bottom left, we get these two very characteristic peaks. These are the fatty salts. These are the wavelengths of the fatty salts. These are present. Then we have the presence of a burial. And if we don't, in the top left, you can see that those are not present. And we can feel comfortable that there are not any, at least fatty salts in that unit. On the right, we can see the difference between the insertion pressure. And so generally we would get something like the red line, which is just very linear. So as you're pushing in, it just gets a little bit harder. But the black and the blue lines are indicating that it gets harder for a bit. And then while you're going through the burial pit itself, it's much softer. And then at the bottom, it gets harder again. And so lining these two streams of data up can give us fairly accurate results about where burials are. So why would you use soil spectroscopy? One is that you get immediate results right in the field. And so that's fantastic. It allows you to start with GPR or other anomalies and work directly on them and try to confirm whether or not this anomaly is in fact a human burial, and then move on to others. The probe has a sensitive pressure meter, and so it does stop when it encounters rocks, roots, or bones, and so it shouldn't disturb the burial. No soil is removed in this process. As I said, it is minimally invasive, and so its use is really up to the communities. This is a different technology than GPR and magnetometry, and some communities won't be comfortable with the fact that it does go into the ground and may encounter the burial. And so this is not for everyone, but for communities that want to use this, it can give very quickly confidence in the results, and it can also combat denialism. And so this is something that we've all faced in our work. Some members of the public say that GPR can't tell you 100% if human remains are present. Well, soil spectroscopy can. And so hopefully that will quiet the doubters that we have to deal with every day. So this is not a survey technology. It wouldn't make sense to do this over a huge area. We're doing grids of 5 or 10 centimeters, and so we're focusing on previously identified anomalies. And so our traditional discovery phase that's going to involve archival research, survivor knowledge leading to field survey, GPR and magnetometry, LiDAR, all of these other things are going to tell us exactly where to go with soil spectroscopy. We call this the confirmation phase. And then what that is going to allow the community to do is talk about next steps. And Kisha mentioned this. It may be the specific protection of individual grave locations. It could be memorialization, putting monuments at each one. Or for some communities that want to excavate and try to identify each of these remains, soil spectroscopy is going to point you to the ones that are in fact burials and allow that process to work much more efficiently. So that's all I've got. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And please also check out the S4 Laboratories website. They're fantastic research partners. And we believe that there will be 3 operating systems in Canada starting in the spring. And so it should be available for your searches if you want to go down that route. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terry, for sharing about this new technology that's emerging to help with that confirmation piece, the kind of between locating potential areas and any further work that might need to be undertaken. Wanted to introduce another method that can help with identifying potential human remains around residential school landscapes. And so I'm going to invite our final speaker of the presentations. And just as a reminder, at any time, you can put questions into the chat. If you're in the Zoom space, you can add them to the Zoom chat. If you are watching on YouTube, you can also add them in the chat on YouTube. We will track them and try to address them once our final presenter is done. So our final presenter is Dr. Sarah Beaulieu, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Social, Cultural, and Media Studies at the University of the Fraser Valley. She's an expert on the search for unmarked graves in many different contexts, has a lot of experience in this, and has been supporting searches at residential schools in BC and beyond. So turn it over to you, Dr. Beaulieu.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here today and to be able to share this with you. I'm just going to pull my screen up here. So I've been working with remote sensing within an archaeological context for more than a decade now. But as we've been hearing today, this search work requires a multifaceted approach. And when an opportunity presented itself to work with more than just, machine remote sensing methods, and also work with more of a sentient being, detection dogs. I jumped in with both feet. And so with this, I've been working with dog and handler teams on a number of searches, and also been conducting research in order to find the methods that are best suited for the search for the missing children. So I'm going to begin by talking about the different types of detection dogs, their benefits to the search for the missing children. I'll talk about how the searches are conducted in case you are considering this for your own work, and also importantly, the challenges with using these dogs, the issues with human scent detection and sourcing, the correct training materials with these dogs, and finally, I'll leave you with some recommendations on what to look for when contracting detection dog teams. I'm going to be talking about human remains in more detail than I normally would with other remote sensing methods. My photos are generic for this purpose because the work is sensitive, but I did want to flag this before going on any further. So broadly speaking, there are two main types or two main categories of detection dogs that aid in the search for missing persons. So the key here is that they search in different ways, and they also train on different materials to pick up scent. The first category are the search dogs. So these dogs find living individuals that have gone missing. They're trained to sample air currents for traces of human scent. So the key here is that they're scenting with their noses in the air as opposed to noses to the ground. But today we're focusing on the second category of detection dogs, in which there are 3 different types of canine searches that apply to deceased individuals. The most common are the human remains detection dogs. These are previously known as cadaver dogs. There are also the historic human remains detection dogs, which are more of a recent inclusion. And the last category are the cremains detection dogs. So both human remains and historic human remains detection dogs focus their search on the scent of decomposition odor. They're also importantly taught to ignore any other scent, including animal remains. Human remains detection dogs concentrate on more recently deceased individuals, while the historic ones focus on older buried remains. In the United States and also in Europe, these dogs have been able to detect remains that date back about 9,000 years. The third category, the cremains detection dogs, these are trained to search for burnt remains or on ash in the absence of other human traces. So you may have heard of these dogs being used more recently with the devastating fires in Hawaii. More recently, it was thought that these dogs needed to be trained to specialize in one of these 3 fields, and to some degree they still need to. But it's also possible for the dogs to be cross-trained in more than one of the human remains detection areas for a number of reasons that I'll get into in a little bit. Historic human remains detection dogs can be extremely useful when searching for the missing children from residential schools and hospital sites, particularly when large areas require investigation. The search dogs and handler teams can cover a significant number of acres per day. This does depend, though, on how many teams are being used and whether human remains have been detected. If they have been, the search needs to slow considerably, which then becomes a little bit more time-consuming. These dogs can effectively narrow search areas prior to beginning other remote sensing methods, which will also greatly reduce the cost and time required for other geophysical surveys. And as with any other, additional method, our confidence in GPR results and other remote sensing methods will increase when we have positive identifications from detection dogs. These dogs also work well in buildings, so the school itself or other outbuildings, smaller structures, when other remote sensing methods are not conducive to the work. So how do these dogs search? These dogs alert to decomposition odor when compounds released into the soil eventually come to the surface. So over time, the odor naturally rises above a burial, but it can also concentrate in locations that are further away for various reasons, some of it which can include soil disturbances from animal tunneling, tree root systems or other vegetation, and also airflow from cracks in concrete and brick, walls and flooring, both inside and outside of buildings. And because of this, detection dogs will not necessarily identify the exact location nor the specific number of burials, but they can confirm with relative confidence whether human remains are present. The dogs are trained to alert once they have located the area with the highest concentration of scent. And so with this, they're going to present what we call a trained final response. And these trained final responses can be observed in a number of different ways. It can be sitting at the point of the highest concentration, it can be lying down with their nose on it, or it can just be standing and barking. This really is at the trainer's preference. But what is most important here is that it requires a calmer, slower, and also a more methodical dog than their search dog counterparts. Next, I'm going to describe what takes place during these canine searches. Should you be thinking about these next steps? When deploying these dogs, it's essential to bring in at least 3 separate dog teams that work independently from one another. In an ideal situation, the dogs have been trained on different source material in order to mitigate false positives from contamination, but this isn't always possible. You will also want to bring in 1 dog team at a time, and also ensure that the other teams are not present for the current search. Ideally, the dogs will work off leash, but sometimes out of necessity, they will be working online. The reason for running the dog teams independently is to eliminate bias from the search results. As much as the dog handlers, just like any of us, try to remain impartial, the dogs are smart and they're extremely in tune to their handler's body language. And so if a handler inadvertently focuses or hesitates in a particular location, the dog will pick up on this and may falsely alert. So to begin, you would first bring in, the first dog and handler team to conduct the search. If this dog were to alert, you would then GPS in these coordinates and bring in the second dog and handler team. The second dog is either going to confirm the first dog's results. It may alert in completely different locations or near the initial location, and it could potentially not alert at all. And this is why bringing in a third dog is really important. In order to have confidence in the alerts, you require that at least 2 dogs alert in the same locations. So now let's talk about some of the challenges of using detection dogs for these searches. Dogs are beings. They're not machines. They cannot be run for indefinite amounts of time. Scent work, the search work, is tiring since they're using a large portion of their brain to do this work in often physically demanding locations. Some statistics show, for instance, that 15 minutes of search work is equivalent to a human running 9 miles. And so they need to break often. And just like people, they can have off days and not be at the top of the game while they're conducting a search. Weather also plays, like with other remote sensing methods, an important factor with these searches. Working during the winter months on frozen or snow-covered ground is not recommended because the scent will not be released from the ground for the dogs to detect. The summer months may also present challenges to detection. During the hot temperatures, the odor rises too quickly and dissipates from the Earth's surface, and this also reduces detectability. And so the most ideal times for these searches are the spring and the fall, when the weather is cooler and the scent remains closer to the ground. The searches can continue in the summer months as long as they're done earlier or later in the day. The other challenge for dog handlers is accessing the correct training materials that are associated with human scent in order for the dogs to learn exactly what they're searching for. Because of this, not all dog handler teams are made equal. Not training on the correct material will lead to poor results. The dog's nose is extremely sensitive. It has up to 300 million olfactory receptors. We only have 6 million. So in addition to this, the part of their brain that is dedicated to interpreting scent is about 40 times larger than our own. Their nose is so sensitive that they can detect the equivalent of half a teaspoon of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But when it comes to human searches, we are actually unsure what the specific compounds are that the dogs are hitting on, and this makes it really challenging for training them. Historic human remains detection dogs were initially being trained to focus on old bone and teeth, but more recent research from those that study the biochemical processes of human decomposition, they've chemically analyzed the odor profile of human bones that are only about 2 to 3 years post-mortem. And what they've found is that there's a reduced number and concentration of volatile compounds in the bones. And so this means that there's very little scent that's actually emanating off of these old bones, making it less likely that the dogs are relying solely on this when they're alerting to human remains. But the dogs are alerting to something because they've been successful in locating ancient burials. And so the question becomes, if it's not the bone or the teeth, what are the chemical compounds in human scent that the dogs are alerting to? I suspect that it's more likely that these historic human remains detection dogs are alerting to adipocere. It's a combination of the fatty acids and alkali salts that remain in the soil. And these fatty salts are the same ones that Dr. Clark has just been discussing with the S4 machine. So these are likely what the dogs are detecting in the soil. And so with this, we are inclined to think that the dogs, their training focus needs to rely not just on the old bone and teeth, but needs to include other components of decomposition, particularly those that remain in the burial shaft for a considerable period of time. Access to these additional components to help best prepare the dogs for these searches can also be more challenging. And because of this, dedicated handlers tend to travel to the United States for training because of the different regulations that they have with regards to human remains that we don't have here in Canada. There's also importantly an ethical component to accessing the proper training materials here in Canada in order to expose the dogs to the correct training material. There's also no national standard in Canada for certifying the detection dogs on older burials. Anyone can claim that they have a dog that detects ancient or historic human burials. The RCMP does have their own training program for their own dogs, but nothing that canine handlers outside of the RCMP can access. Several Canadian organizations do, however, hold American or other certification. And because of this, it's important to determine what types of training and certification each particular dog and handler team have. And so to close or to finish this off, I'm going to leave you with some recommendations when looking to contact or contract detection dog services. Search dogs are typically trained over a 2-year period and have at least 2,000 hours of training and experience during this time. They have resumes and logbooks as well that you can ask about and inquire into so that you know which teams are respectable or not. These logbooks need to be kept up to date, and it will provide you with an idea of how much training and experience each dog team has. Their resumes will also give you an idea of the types of searches that they have previously undertaken. And by resumes, I'm actually talking about the dog's resume and not the handler's resume. So you should also ask what types of training material they've focused on. For instance, there are search dog teams trained in live scent that are offering to help with these searches. And this really is not beneficial to anyone. And so with any of this work, of course, be careful of attention seekers, media hounds, those that are boastful of their claims. And lastly, when searching for the missing children, it's important to ensure that the organization providing the dogs have ones with the specialized training required for your specific search. Because although each of the residential schools and hospital site searches are similar in nature, there will still be things that are unique and specific to each of your own sites. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing about the role of search dogs in this difficult task. So what we had wanted to do is provide information about these different techniques, which, as I think a number of the speakers talked about, can be layered. And this is really important if you could imagine, for example, a landscape where a ground penetrating radar survey has found some anomalies, and then you can bring in the search dogs, or you can bring in the S4, or you could bring in both to increase the confidence that what is in the GPR may in fact be an unmarked burial. And this is really the purpose of what we wanted to bring are options. Now, every community who is leading a search will need to make decisions that is right for their survivors and for what their community is looking for. But there are steps between ground penetrating radar and exhumation or excavation that can be explored in order to build that confidence. So at this time, we invite any questions that you have. We have a few that I will start to address. Some of them I may be able to answer directly. Others I will ask the panelists to answer if this is their particular area of expertise. The first question is, will there be a downloadable handout for the webinar? We certainly will have the recording available. We can work with the presenters to provide a PDF of the slides, but if there's interest in a handout or a series of handouts around the different methods, we certainly can take that back and think about developing them. For the geophysical and remote sensing techniques, the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group on Unmarked Graves has some material already, but for the S4 and the search dogs, that is still in development, and so there aren't necessarily easy handouts yet. We will take that under advisement and provide that information once we've been able to follow up with the presenters as well. So there is a question that probably Ed is best suited to answer. So the question is, what is unsuitable geology when using magnetometry?
It depends. It's going to depend on a number of factors. You can either if your parent material, so if the geology is some types of sandstone or limestone don't actually have any iron minerals in them, so the actual topsoil itself doesn't have a lot in there to start with, so you don't really get an enormous difference in the amount of magnetic properties between the topsoil and the subsoil. And then the opposite to that would be in some areas where you might have very thin overlying soils above igneous, so volcanic rocks, which are very highly magnetic. That can be even a bigger issue. Yeah, there's those would be the two, but you know, just because you're in an area, let's say the Canadian Shield, where you know you might not anticipate the technique to work that well. If the area actually has relatively high deposit, or rather thick deposits above the geology, then it can still work. Yeah, I guess the key would be, you know, quite often we use magnetic susceptibility survey to determine the likelihood of magnetometry, whether it will be successful or not. You basically take a sample from the topsoil and you take a sample from the subsoil, and you see if there's going to be a big enough difference there to potentially find something.
Thank you for that response. I hope that was helpful. So the next question, which was also answered in the chat, but I will read it out in part because this is being translated. And so for our Francophone listeners or people viewing afterwards, it's helpful to have them. So the question is, can you tell if the bones belong to a First Nation and how? With the methods that were discussed in this webinar, there is no way to tell who is in a burial or whether or not they're First Nations. That would require a forensics approach. And just as a reminder, we do have an introduction to forensics webinar on the National Advisory Committee website. And there are also some resources linked through the National Advisory Committee around different considerations for identification, because it is complicated and requires different kinds of testing. So this is more of a presence of human remains, not who is in any particular grave, if there is a grave present. So that was the response to that question. There was a question about a frequency recommended when looking for burials, the investigation depth limit. I did ask a follow-up because I was curious about which technique you're asking about, because that might have a somewhat different answer. For example, if you're asking about ground penetrating radar, there are recommended frequencies. With magnetics, Scott, sorry, Ed, if you wanted to jump in here, I don't think that it's as the same kind of consideration, but if there is anything you wanted to add vis-a-vis frequency relating to magnetometry, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, there are, it's a good question. There are a few things you do need to think about. There are quite a few flavors of sort of magnetometers. So generally in archaeology, we use something called a flux gate gradiometer. I'm certainly happy to sort of pass on more information about that if they want to contact me directly.
So when using GPR, David, to respond to that. So in general, the folks who I know and my own team who've done it, we tend to range between 250 to 500 megahertz, which seems to be the ideal balance between depth. So we can get down, you know, potentially 2.5 meters, depending on the soil conditions, and detail. to get enough resolution in order to detect the kinds of traits that are associated with unmarked graves. There has been a recent publication by Dr. Martindale and colleagues around what is sort of known in the literature around ground penetrating radar and the signals that are most effective for that, because it's quite well established across the world. So 1 gigahertz is going to probably lead to something that's too shallow. I have used 900 megahertz in contexts where you're looking at very shallow deposits, but in a lot of the places where we work, the gigahertz might give you more detail, but not get you down far enough necessarily. So, but this is still evolving and is an ongoing conversation around what is the appropriate frequencies. But typically right now, the range of 250 to 500 megahertz is common. Conversations about occurring identification of victims. There certainly are conversations that communities are having. Some of the work of the offices of special interlocutor on missing children and unmarked graves is also considering what that might look like. What this particular webinar is about is finding the areas that could then be further investigated for identification, because we're seeing sometimes a bit of a gap between interpreting of GPR results, which can map different kinds of buried features, graves being one of them, but not the only one, and wanting to take those next steps. So this is designed to say, how can we be as certain as we can be without excavating that there is a human remains present, and then what could happen around identification. But that again gets into the realm of forensics, not necessarily the archaeologists who are on the call today. There is also a question about bodies not buried in a coffin. And I wonder, perhaps, Terry, if you wanted to take a first go at this one, to address how that might work with the S4 soil probe.
Sure. Yeah, so in fact, if they were in a coffin, it would be more difficult for us. The probe will essentially stop when it hits the wood. But generally, the children buried at former residential school sites were not buried in coffins. If there is a part of the cemetery that was used, then they might be. But generally, they don't follow this sort of Christian standard of being buried in rows at a 6 feet depth or anything like that. And so we found that we're able to detect these burials quite easily.
Yes, thank you, Terry, for that. So like you're saying that in the S4 context, having a coffin actually could make it more challenging. There's also some evidence to suggest that in ground penetrating radar, if there is a coffin burial, sometimes the coffin may be visible as part of the reflection in terms of the fact that there's wood and then air and then soil. But again, it's either way, a coffin doesn't have to be buried in a coffin to potentially be detected using these techniques. And then I guess this might also be a question, Sarah, that I'm not sure how this is impacted with search dogs, if you have anything to contribute around that in terms of coffin burials.
Yeah, if they're not in coffins, it's certainly easier for the scent concentration to be released. And so it's much, much easier for the dogs to detect those remains. So much more likely.
Yes, thanks very much, Sarah. There was a question about current numbers of children. I would direct any questions about more specific numbers to the Student Memorial Register for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, because there is no nation that is at a stage now to be able to confirm exactly how many children from any given school have gone missing. And so that's not a question that folks on this webinar are in a position to respond to, but the Memorial Register currently lists 4,142 children that are known to have died at residential schools. Airborne magnetometry. So this is a question around planning to use airborne magnetometry and how close to the ground would it need to be, and what are some factors to consider? And I'm not sure if you wanted to respond to this one, if you have anything to contribute.
So I've not actually used airborne magnetometry. I know it's been used in other contexts, such as searching for exploded or unexploded ordnance. In those instances, the target is actually very, very magnetic, so relatively easy to identify. I'd be a little concerned about its ability to identify a burial. That's not to say that this is not an avenue that would be worth exploring in much the same way as I know people are looking at sort of drone-mounted GPR, but we might have similar issues with the sort of spatial resolution and the accuracy of the GPS location for the number of data points that are required. Burials can be sort of, or rather when we're looking for the sort of differences in the sort of topsoil, we might be looking for sort of 3 or 4 nanotesla and 50, like a background. The Earth's magnetic field in any area is sort of 50 to 70,000 nanotesla, and we can be looking for something as small as sort of 3 or 4. So really very, very, very tiny differences. Yeah, I don't know if that would be a suitable approach, but that would be certainly something maybe worth investigating.
Thank you so much for that, Ed. And again, this is one of those areas where there could be potentials to refine aspects of the technology, but I mean, myself and I know others on the call are careful not to treat residential schools as experimental landscapes. So the more we can do this in other kinds of environments that could be applicable, historic cemeteries or places with known older burials that are not as sensitive, I think it's really important to test that. And get a sense of what it can be seen with those technologies prior to conducting a larger scale residential school search. And there is a question around expenses, so sort of saying that these are methods that can be layered on to ground penetrating radar, but obviously would require additional costs to community potentially. I'm not sure if anyone on the call wants to speak to cost or budgeting. It's a very tricky question because there's a lot of factors that go into it. But I will invite any of the presenters to speak to what they spoke on if they wanted to provide anything around cost.
Well, shall I jump in first?
Go ahead.
I've not actually purchased a magnetometer for a while now. And also I have the distinct advantage of, being at a university, so we get reduced costs. But you're certainly looking, I would have thought, within sort of $20,000 to $30,000 range for sort of a magnetometer. Again, it slightly depends on what you're getting and how many sensors you want that to have. One of the advantages of actually the magnetic susceptibility meter and probe is it's actually considerably cheaper, maybe quarter of the price. So that might be an option, but again, we need to sort of establish how well that's going to work and how useful it will be before sort of recommending that communities sort of go out and purchase that.
Yes, thanks for that, Ed. And I certainly, if there's other folks who wanted to jump in, I'll just make a note that there is that question of, how much would it cost to purchase and develop that capacity for a community versus how much would it cost to hire someone to do it or to work with a partner such as a university or, another kind of organization. And I think this is something to consider because like with ground penetrating radar, this is a specialized use of technology. So having a magnetic radiometer doesn't necessarily mean you know how to apply it in this context. So just as a word of caution, always being very careful if you're working with a third party that they know how to use a technology for this purpose and can do so in a respectful and culturally sensitive manner. Does anyone else want to jump in on the cost? Sarah, I don't know if you want to mention something about dogs, because there might be questions about that as well in terms of cost.
Unmuted. I think the dogs are relatively inexpensive in comparison to some other methods. I think the teams across Canada cost between $200 to $500, depending on the dog handler team, per dog and handler per day. And then, of course, the cost for mobilization to get out to that area. And I would say it would take, depending on the site, 1 to 2 days, sometimes longer. It also depends on weather, though, but relatively less expensive. I don't know if I would recommend purchasing dogs. I've heard they're upwards of $20,000 to train, and it's you're working with them 2 to 3 times a week on top of everything else. So I think it's easier in this case to bring in certified teams for the work.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There's also a question about the methods being available now. They are. The folks who have presented here are people who've used various aspects of these technologies in different kinds of ways, sometimes for many years. There are search dog teams, for example, that are available, and the S4, as Terry mentioned, there are likely to be at least 3 operational, including one that will sit with my team, one that will sit with Terry's team, which can potentially be deployed. So if you are a community who is looking for, say you've done some ground penetrating radar and are looking for other kinds of things, please do reach out. You can reach out through the National Advisory Committee. And we can connect you with folks to talk about wanting to bring in different kinds of technology. With the S4 and the search dogs in particular, you would be looking at the earliest being spring for the reasons sort of presented. We can't really push a probe into frozen ground. And then, of course, with the search dogs, it's not an ideal time. But if you want to start those conversations now, certainly reach out and we can connect you with who we know is working in these areas. Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
Just to mention that the LiDAR is now commercially available. You can purchase both people who will come and conduct this work for you, and it's becoming quite common. If you were interested in doing it yourself, a drone unit with a modern camera will cost about $50,000. A handheld unit is slightly cheaper. There's also processing and software that you would need to have, probably $5,000 to $10,000 on top of that, plus training. The only caution I would suggest is that people who deploy LiDAR for industrial purposes may not have quite the understanding of the kind of landscapes and resolution that we are looking for. So we'll be looking at developing guidance on how to conduct LiDAR surveys for the work that we are engaged in. And of course, our suggested method is that communities who are interested develop this capacity themselves. Indigenous Services Canada offers training for Indigenous community members to fly drones and get licensed. And I know they're considering adding a LiDAR component to their training. Mm-hmm. The other equipment, the underwater equipment, hasn't really been deployed yet, hasn't been used in this context yet. So I would be cautious about doing that without waiting a little bit to see, and maybe be in touch with me about where we're at. You can add side scanning sonar for about $2,000 to an existing boat. The multi-beam devices are $200,000, and the sub-bottom profilers are in the neighborhood of $40,000 to $60,000. So considerable investments, and they really need to be developed, I think, for this application. So I would be cautious about purchasing this equipment right away, because it hasn't yet been evaluated in the context of our work.
Thank you, Andrew. So there is another question, and it sort of relates to another comment that was made in the chat around what's already available. A couple of things just to note in terms of knowledge about the land that has been gathered over the past century or more, including historic aerial photos. And then now, of course, there are many satellites in orbit collecting all kinds of data about the Earth's surface. There's also larger LiDAR data sets, for example, that are being made more publicly available. There is potential use for some of these. The historic aerial photos, the Indigenous Services Canada has made some of these available through a platform, which we can find the link for. These are really useful in layering into that geographic information system because they will show the landscape over time. And in some places, you can get back to the 1920s and certainly most areas of Canada, the 1940s. And this shows the school landscapes over time as buildings change or shift, they're useful to map on the data that we are collecting right now. They're also useful for survivors because it can help to orient them based on what they remember, so they can see the landscape they remember. There is work yet to do to figure out what data is at a high enough resolution to potentially contribute to the work that is being undertaken now with ground searching. One area that my team has been working a little bit with is multispectral or hyperspectral imaging, which you sometimes will hear about in forensic cases, but it does deal with mapping vegetation and changes in vegetation. So if there's high enough resolution and there's a space where there could be graves, that might be useful, but it's not fully yet been explored. I think that there could be a space in a later webinar to talk more specifically about some of the spatial data that could be deployed from the older geological surveys, from existing data sets, to be able to provide greater information and direct some of the searching as well. Sarah, there is a question specifically for you around the dogs and how do they detect in bodies of water?
They have been used for by search teams for drowning victims. It works in the same way as the scent emanating to the surface. And they have been successful with that. I think it may be a little bit more challenging for significantly older remains, and would definitely need to be looked into further. But with more recent remains from drowning victims, it has been successful.
Thank you. And I have worked in a context where there was a dog team that scented along a body of water, and they weren't entirely sure what they were scenting, but it is something that could be complementing other kinds of searching as well. So there is another question. It looks like the last one we currently have in our chat. So if there are any final questions, please feel free to add them now. And this is there an established protocol for how to engage First Nations for this work, or is it up to each nation and community to develop this on their own? I'll speak from my own perspective. I'll also invite my colleagues who are on the call. I certainly only ever do this work when approached. So what has happened is when communities know that there are people who are doing this work, they come to me, they come to my team, and they say, you know, can you help? Can you provide advice? Can you develop something to come and talk to our survivors? So we very much follow community lead. And that's especially important in terms of ceremony and protocol, because every nation will have their own approach to that. And you know, I always see my role as being one of being in service, providing the knowledge I have so they can make informed decisions. So I think that while there is a general sense that there are many parts to this work, there are many steps in the process, it is up to communities to determine the pathway that works best for their survivors, for the landscape where their school was located, and then bring in help where that help might be needed. Another really important part about this that I think is essential is all of these methods generate information and data. So making sure that the nation has control and access and ownership and protection, OCAP, over any data that's generated, and ensuring that whenever you're bringing in a team or an individual to work on this very sensitive information, that there is clear protocols around data sovereignty and ensuring security of that data by the nation. And that's another thing that I think we'll hopefully address in a future webinar, because it is really essential to this work. You know, this is not a space where that information should be shared in any context without permission, without explicit permission by communities. There is also a couple of additional questions. Again, Sarah, I think there's one about dogs either being on the edge, or do they go out in boats, if you happen to know that. And then there's also a question about how long would the scent endure, although I think you did address that in terms of there is examples from 9,000-year-old bones being detected by dogs, or something related to the burial being detected by the dogs.
Sorry, so the question is, if they're out on water, do they go out in boats? They do grid searches, much like we do with our other remote sensing surveys, and the dogs do alert that way. as far as scent, we know that the grave wax, the adipocere in the soil lasts for quite a long time, and dogs have been able to detect it. I've seen reports up to 9,000 years.
Thank you, Sarah. David, I see you have a question as well around resistivity. So yes, there have been examples of resistivity that have been applied, as well as electromagnetic conductivity as two other potentials for mapping. EM conductivity is probably better established than resistivity. The challenge with a lot of the ways that resistivity data are collected is it's very, very slow. So it could be effective, and it could be another method that can be used. And if there's more information that would be useful to share, we have some of those resources on the Canadian Archaeological Association website, but we could also think about developing more specific presentations around that as well, because resistivity and EM conductivity are other geophysical techniques which could potentially provide that extra layer of data. It will depend, of course, on the context as well. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, so I am going to invite Harley Croshoe back to close us off in a good way and make sure that as we leave this space after talking about this difficult topic, that we don't take too much back with us. So I will turn the floor back over to Harley before we close the webinar.
Thank you, Kisha, and I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. Technology sometimes can be a little bit finicky, but it seems to be working. I just thought today was an incredible day. It was an opportunity to really hear from the people that have that knowledge, that expertise in different tools that we can use for ground searches and hearing of the new technology. That was, some of this, I knew was out there, but didn't know how it worked, the purpose of it, and how it can help us, guide us in the searches. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your working knowledge, your expertise on the LiDAR and also the underwater searches. Certainly, my smartphone is smarter now. I know that that's the technology that is used with it at times. But, one of the key messages that you said was that it's not how it works, but that it works. And that's true, because we need to use technology that are going to help us, and certainly, whatever tool we use, it's nice to know that there's some people that have the working knowledge that can guide us and really utilize it for the purpose it's meant for. And I want to thank Edward Eastaugh for sharing, the magnetic survey methods, and certainly one of the things that you did mention that these tools certainly do help narrow down the searches, and they all serve a purpose. They all have different usage for them, and then also for Dr. Terrence Clark for sharing the new technology that's emerging out there, and also it helps with the immediate results in the field, and just learning about and hearing about the new technology. It is certainly something that would be very useful, as a tool, and depending on the need and depending on whether that type of technology is workable in the area that we're searching. So it's thank you for sharing that, and then also with Dr. Sarah Beaulieu, for sharing the gifts that our four-legged relatives give us, the dog searches, and just how they are relatives, and they do get tired out, but the gifts the Creator gave them, and be able to detect you know, the remains is just incredible, and how to use them, and you know, they are a tool, and all of the tools that were shared here today, it just, you know, will really certainly help us. And thank you, Kisha, for moderating, and also for sharing your expertise and your knowledge, but also all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us and provide, you know, the information that would help us during the ground searches. So with that, I'm going to say a short prayer and thank everybody for being part of this, and certainly, you know, I urge you to reach out further, you know, and if there's questions or if there's ideas that you might have, you know, and you just want to, you know, present them, you know, do that, because, you know, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to find our children that never came home. So, you know, all the help and all the commitment that's provided here is really thankful. We're thankful for that. So I'll say a short prayer, and then we'll wrap this up. Creator, Grandfather, thank you for today. Thank you for this opportunity to hear about the tools and the methods that are out there and the technology, and for the presenters that shared, you know, their experience, their knowledge, their expertise on these tools, and how they can be used, and the purpose of where these tools can be implemented. Creator, we thank you for that, because it helps us, you know, see that there is, you know, that support, and that those gifts that we can use as we move forward, and also for our four-legged relatives that give so much of themselves to us, you know, not only to comfort us, but also to help us during these searches for our children. Creator, thank you for being able to come to you and in prayer, and be able to get a sense of how much you love us, Creator, and how you watch over us each and every day, and for helping us when we need clarity, for helping us when we need guidance, and for guiding us on this journey in a good way, in a strong way, and with a strong voice, Creator, as we move forward. Thank you for the many gifts you've given us. And again, Creator, I ask for beauty above us, ask for beauty below us, ask for beauty around us, ask for beauty in each and every one of us, Creator, as we journey forward. All my relations. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you again to Elder Crowshoe and to all our presenters. Just as a reminder, this video will be posted on the NAC website as well as on the NCTR YouTube channel. And also there will be future webinars, so please stay tuned for that. So we appreciate you all being with us, and there are supports available if this has been impacting you and you need additional support. So with that, we will say goodbye, Exe, and hope you have a good rest of your day.